We shouldn't be here.
It's too late for that now.
A terrified waitress approached a Hells Angels biker in a desperate plea for protection from her abusive husband. What this leather-clad stranger did next would not only save her life, but transform an entire community's understanding of brotherhood, justice, and redemption. This is a story that challenges everything you think you know about bikers, domestic violence, and the unexpected heroes who emerge when society turns its back. Stay until the end, because what happens in Chapter 5 will leave you speechless. And we want to hear from you. Have you ever witnessed a stranger step in to help someone in danger? Share your story in the comments below. The Desert Rose Diner sat on the edge of Reno, Nevada, where the city's neon glow faded into darkness and the Sierra Nevada mountains loomed like silent witnesses. It was the kind of place where truckers stopped for coffee at 3 in the morning and locals knew better than to ask questions. On this particular November evening in 2016, the air carried that sharp, cold bite that only high desert nights can deliver. Sarah Mitchell had been working the closing shift for 3 years. At 28 years old, she moved through the diner with practiced efficiency, her blonde hair pulled back in a tight ponytail, her smile mechanical but professional. To the casual observer, she was just another waitress counting down the minutes until closing time. But those who looked closer might have noticed the way she flinched when the door opened too suddenly, or how she positioned herself with her back to the wall whenever possible. The last customer of the night rolled into the parking lot just before 10 o'clock. The rumble of his Harley Davidson announced his arrival long before he walked through the door. Jack Davidson, known in the Hells Angels as Reaper, was 42 years old and looked exactly like what he was, a man who had lived a hard life and wore it like armor. His leather vest displayed the distinctive winged death's head patch of the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club, Reno chapter. At 6'3" and 240 pounds, with a salt and pepper beard and eyes that had seen too much, he commanded attention without saying a word. Sarah approached his booth with a coffee pot, her standard greeting dying on her lips as she caught sight of him. For a moment, something flickered in her eyes, not fear, but calculation. Jack noticed he had spent 20 years reading people, and this woman was screaming silent distress signals that most people were too busy to hear. He ordered coffee and apple pie. She brought it without a word, but her hands trembled slightly as she set down the plate. Jack continued reading his newspaper, but his attention was divided. Something was wrong. The diner was empty except for them and the cook in the back. Through the window, he could see the parking lot illuminated by a single flickering streetlight. That's when Sarah saw the truck, a lifted Ford F-150, metallic blue, with a cracked windshield and a dent in the driver's side door. She knew that truck the way a soldier knows the sound of incoming fire. Her face went pale beneath the carefully applied makeup that couldn't quite hide the yellowing bruise on her left cheekbone. Derek Mitchell was early. He usually waited until she walked to her car before starting his nightly routine of intimidation and control. But tonight, he was pulling into the parking lot, and Sarah knew from the aggressive way he parked that he was already angry about something. Maybe he'd been drinking at Murphy's bar down the road. Maybe he'd lost money on a football game. The reason never really mattered. The outcome was always the same. Sarah made a decision that would change the trajectory of multiple lives. She walked directly to Jack's booth, slid into the seat across from him without permission, reached across the table and took his hand. Her voice was low and urgent, cracking with desperation that no amount of pride could disguise. "Please," she said, "I need you to pretend you're my boyfriend, just for a few minutes. That man coming in, he's my husband, and if he thinks I'm alone, he'll hurt me. I know this is crazy. I know you don't know me, but please." Jack's eyes moved from Sarah's face to the parking lot, where Derek Mitchell was now stepping out of his truck. Even from a distance, Jack could read the body language, the aggressive swagger, the clenched fists, the territorial scanning of the environment. He'd seen this type before. Hell, he'd been this type once, a lifetime ago, before his sister's murder had taught him what it meant to fail someone who needed protection. He squeezed Sarah's hand gently and spoke in a voice that was surprisingly calm. calm. Okay, I'm your boyfriend. What's his name? Derek. Derek Mitchell. Jack nodded slowly. When he comes in, you let me do the talking. And Sarah, after tonight, this doesn't end here. You understand me? Sarah's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them back. She didn't understand what he meant, but she nodded anyway. At that moment, she would have agreed to anything. The diner door swung open with enough force to make the bell above it ring violently. Derek Mitchell stood in the doorway, his frame backlit by the parking lot lights, creating a shadow that seemed to fill the entire space. He was 32 years old, worked construction when he felt like it, and had a criminal record that included 2 domestic violence arrests that never led to convictions. His reputation in certain circles of Reno was that of a man you didn't cross, a man with connections to people who could make problems disappear. He spotted Sarah immediately, and his face twisted into an expression of possessive rage. But then he saw Jack, saw Sarah's hand in the biker's rough palm, and something shifted in his eyes, a momentary confusion that quickly hardened into dangerous anger. Derek crossed the diner in 5 long strides. "Get up, Sarah. We're leaving. Now." Sarah's grip on Jack's hand tightened, but she said nothing. Jack, meanwhile, leaned back in his seat with deliberate casualness, his free hand resting on the table where Derek could see it. His voice, when he spoke, was conversational, almost friendly. "Evening. I don't think we've met. I'm Jack." Derek's face flushed red. "I don't give a damn who you are. That's my wife, and she's coming with me." Jack tilted his head slightly, studying Derek the way an entomologist might study an interesting but ultimately insignificant insect. "See, here's the thing, Derek. Sarah's having coffee with me right now, and when we're done, I'm going to give her a ride home. So why don't you head on out, cool off, and we can all wake up tomorrow with a clear head." The suggestion hung in the air like a lit fuse. Derek's hands clenched into fists, and for a moment, violence seemed inevitable. But then he really looked at Jack, at the vest, at the patches, at the way this man sat with the absolute confidence of someone who had nothing to prove and nothing to fear. Derek had heard stories about what happened to people who put their hands on Hell's Angels members. "You think that vest scares me?" Derek's voice was loud now, compensating for the fear he didn't want to acknowledge. "You think I'm afraid of some biker trash?" Jack's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes went cold. "I think you're a man who hits women because it makes you feel powerful. I think you've been getting away with it because Sarah's been too scared to ask for help, and the people who should have helped her didn't. But that ends tonight. Sarah's under my protection now, mine and my club's. You touch her again, you threaten her again, you even look at her wrong, and you'll find out exactly what this vest means." The cook had emerged from the kitchen now, a heavy-set man named Frank, who had worked at the Desert Rose for 15 years. He stood with a phone in his hand, making it clear he was ready to call the police if necessary. Derek looked from Jack to Frank to Sarah, his mind visibly working through the implications of what was happening. "This isn't over," he said finally, pointing at Sarah. "You're still my wife. You think you can just run off with some biker? I'll have every cop in Reno looking for you." Jack stood up slowly, unfolding to his full height. The movement was unhurried but unmistakably threatening. "You do that. You call every cop you know, and while you're at it, explain to them why your wife has bruises that look about 3 days old. Explain why she's terrified to go home with her own husband. I'm real interested to hear what they say." Derek's bravado cracked just slightly. His connections to local law enforcement were real, but they had limits. A domestic dispute was one thing. A confrontation with the Hell's Angels in front of witnesses was another. He backed toward the door, trying to salvage some dignity from the situation. "You made a big mistake tonight, old man. Both of you." He slammed out of the diner, leaving a vibrating silence in his wake. They watched through the window as he peeled out of the parking lot, his truck's tires squealing on the asphalt. Only when his taillights disappeared down the highway did Sarah finally release Jack's hand. She was shaking violently now, the adrenaline of the confrontation catching up with her. Jack sat back down and gestured for her to do the same. "Talk to me, Sarah. How long?" 6 years. We've been married for 6 years. "And the police?" Sarah laughed, but there was no humor in it. "I've called them 9 times. 9 times. Twice they arrested him, but the charges were dropped both times. One of the officers who responded, he goes fishing with Derek's cousin. Another one told me I should try being a better wife. The last time I called, they took 45 minutes to show up, and by then, Derek had already—" She stopped, unable to finish the sentence. Jack listened without interrupting, his jaw tight. When she finished, he pulled out his phone and made a call. The conversation was brief, cryptic to anyone who might be listening. When he hung hung up, he looked at Sarah with an expression that was somehow both gentle and absolutely fierce. "You got somewhere safe you can stay tonight? Family? Friends?" She shook her head. "He's isolated me from everyone, and I can't afford a hotel. I've been trying to save money to leave, but he monitors my bank account." Jack nodded, as if this confirmed something he'd already suspected. "Here's what's going to happen. You're coming with me to our clubhouse. Before you say anything, there are women there, including the wife of our club president. You'll have a private room, a lock on the door, and about 20 bikers who will make sure Derek doesn't get within a mile of you. Tomorrow, we figure out the next steps, but tonight, you're safe. That's a promise." Sarah wanted to argue, wanted to say that she couldn't accept such an enormous favor from a stranger, that she didn't want to impose or create problems, or any of the other polite objections that had been drilled into her by a lifetime of being told not to make waves. But sitting across from this intimidating man who had just stood up to her husband without hesitation, she found herself believing him. For the first time in 6 years, she felt something that had become foreign to her. She felt hope. "Why are you helping me?" she asked quietly. Jack was silent for a long moment, his eyes distant. "Because someone should have helped my sister, and nobody did. She had a husband like Derek. One night, he went too far, and she didn't survive. I was in prison at the time on weapons charges. I couldn't protect her, but I can protect you." The weight of that confession hung between them. Sarah understood then that this wasn't just about her. It was about justice deferred, about a debt that could never be fully repaid, about a man trying to save someone else's sister because he couldn't save his own. Frank brought over the check, then immediately waved it away when Jack reached for his wallet. "On the house," he said gruffly. "And Sarah, you take care of yourself. You need a job after all this settles. You come see me. We'll work something out." Sarah's eyes filled with tears again, but this time they were tears of gratitude mixed with overwhelming relief. She had spent so long feeling alone, invisible, that these small acts of kindness felt monumental. Jack left cash on the table anyway, including a generous tip, and stood. His motorcycle was parked under the streetlight, chrome gleaming in the artificial glow. He handed Sarah a leather jacket, his spare, and a helmet. She put them on with trembling hands, the jacket enormous on her smaller frame, but warm and somehow reassuring. As they pulled out of the parking lot, Sarah looked back at the Desert Rose Diner one last time. She didn't know it yet, but she would never work there again. That chapter of her life was closing, and whatever came next would be uncharted territory. She wrapped her arms around Jack's waist and held on as they rode through the cold Nevada night toward a destiny that neither of them could have predicted. Behind them, unseen in the darkness beyond the diner's lights, Derek Mitchell sat in his truck, watching. His phone was already out, making calls to people who owed him favors. This was far from over. In fact, in Derek's mind, it had only just begun. The Hells Angels clubhouse in Reno occupied a nondescript building on the industrial edge of town, surrounded by auto repair shops and warehouses that closed at 5 and asked no questions. From the outside, it looked like any other metal-sided structure, unremarkable, forgettable. But inside, it was a fortress. Security cameras covered every angle. The doors were reinforced steel, and the men who gathered there were bound by codes that went deeper than law, older than courts, and more binding than any legal contract. Jack pulled his bike into the compound just after 11. The gate closed behind them with a decisive clang that made Sarah flinch. She climbed off the motorcycle on shaky legs, overwhelmed by the reality of where she was and what had just happened. Through the windows, she could see figures moving inside, large men in leather vests, the distinctive patches catching the light. "Stay close to me," Jack said, his voice gentle but firm. "These are good men, but you're about to walk into a room full of outlaws. Let me do the talking." The clubhouse interior was surprisingly clean and organized. A long bar dominated one wall, flanked by shelves holding an impressive collection of liquor. Pool tables occupied the center of the room. Motorcycle memorabilia covered every available surface. Vintage signs, photographs of rides, framed newspaper clippings documenting the club's 70-year history. About a dozen men were present, ranging in age from their 20s to their 60s, all wearing the same vest that marked them as members of one of the most notorious motorcycle clubs in the world. The conversation stopped when Jack entered with Sarah. Every eye in the room turned to assess the situation. These were men trained by experience to read threats, to calculate odds, to make split-second decisions that could mean the difference between freedom and prison, life and death. They saw immediately that the woman behind Jack was terrified, bruised, and under their brother's protection. Marcus Hammer Thompson, the club president, was 53 years old, with a grey beard and eyes that had seen everything twice. He'd been in the Hells Angels for 31 years, had done 2 stretches in federal prison for racketeering, and commanded respect that went beyond his official title. He set down his beer and walked over, his expression unreadable. Reaper. Who's your friend? Jack guided Sarah to a chair at one of the tables, making sure she was seated before he responded. This is Sarah Mitchell. Her husband tried to put hands on her tonight at the Desert Rose. I intervened. Told him she was under our protection. I brought her here because she's got nowhere else safe to go. The room remained silent, but Sarah could feel the collective attention focused on her. She wanted to shrink, to disappear, to apologize for existing, but something in Jack's steady presence kept her from completely falling apart. Hammer pulled up a chair and sat across from Sarah. His voice, when he spoke, was surprisingly gentle for such an intimidating figure. Ma'am, I need you to tell me exactly what happened tonight. Start to finish. Don't leave anything out. Sarah did. She told them about Derek pulling into the parking lot, about begging Jack to pretend to be her boyfriend, about the confrontation and Derek's threats. And then, because these men seemed to see through lies the way mechanics see through faulty engines, she told them the rest. She told them about 6 years of escalating abuse, about police who didn't respond, about emergency room visits where she lied about how she got injured, about the time Derek broke her ribs and she had to miss 2 weeks of work, about living in constant fear, about money she tried to hide, about the friend who offered to help her leave and then stopped returning her calls after Derek paid her a visit. When she finished, the silence in the clubhouse was absolute. These were hard men who had done hard things, men who operated outside the boundaries of conventional society. But domestic violence occupied a special category of contempt in their world. It violated every principle they held sacred about strength, honor, and what it meant to be a man. A younger member named Tyler spoke up, his voice angry. So we're getting involved in domestic disputes now? That's not club business? That's her problem? Hammer's gaze swung to Tyler like a gun barrel. You got something you want to say, Prospect? Tyler shifted uncomfortably but held his ground. I'm just saying, we start protecting every woman with a bad husband. We're going to be running a shelter instead of a motorcycle club. Where does it end? It ends when we say it ends, Jack said quietly. And for me, it ends when women stop getting beaten by men who think they can get away with it because they're bigger and nobody's watching. Another member, an older man named Robert Snake Williams, leaned forward. I hear what you're saying, Tyler. And you're right that this isn't typical club business. But let me tell you something about Derek Mitchell. He's been running his mouth around town about how he's got connections, how he's untouchable. He's been pushing heroin out of that construction site on 7th Street, undercutting our business, and acting like his cousin being a deputy gives him immunity. So yeah, this is about protecting Sarah. But it's also about reminding certain people in this town that there's only one club that runs things in Reno, and it ain't amateur hour. The political dimension of the situation began to clarify. Derek wasn't just an abusive husband. He was competition. He was disrespectful, and he represented a challenge to the Hells Angels' authority in their own territory. Helping Sarah wasn't just the right thing to do, it was strategically advantageous. But Sarah, listening to this discussion of territory and business, felt sick. She stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the concrete floor. I can't be the reason you go to war with someone. I appreciate what you did tonight, Jack, but maybe I should just leave. Go to Vegas or Sacramento or somewhere Derek won't find me. Sit down, Hammer said. It wasn't a suggestion. Sarah sat. Hammer leaned back in his chair, studying her with those penetrating eyes. You think if you run, Derek stops being a problem? You think he doesn't come after you or find some other woman to terrorize? Men like your husband, they don't stop on their own. They need to be stopped. Now, I'm going to put this to a vote because that's how we do things. But first, I want you to understand something. If this club takes you under our protection, that's a serious commitment. It means we're responsible for you. It means we deal with any threats to you. And it means you follow our rules and our guidance until this situation is resolved. Can you do that? Sarah nodded, not trusting her voice. Hammer looked around the room. All in favor of extending club protection to Sarah Mitchell until such time as the threat from her husband is neutralized. Raise your hand. Every hand went up, even Tyler's, though he didn't look happy about it. All opposed. Silence. Carried unanimously. Jack, she's your responsibility. Make sure she's taken care of. Hammer stood and addressed the room. As of right now, Sarah Mitchell is under the protection protection of the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club, Reno Charter. Anybody fucks with her, they fuck with all of us. Spread the word. A woman emerged from a back room that Sarah hadn't noticed before. Her name was Linda Thompson, Hammer's wife of 28 years. She was 50 years old, with kind eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor that suggested she'd navigated the outlaw biker world long enough to command respect in her own right. "Come on, honey," Linda said to Sarah. "Let's get you set up in the guest room. You look like you could use a shower and some sleep." Sarah followed Linda down a hallway to a small but clean room with a bed, a dresser, and a window with security bars. The door had a lock on the inside, a detail that Linda made sure to point out. "You lock this door from the inside. Nobody gets in without your permission," Linda said. "Bathroom's next door. I'll bring you some clothes. We're about the same size. You hungry?" Sarah shook her head. She was beyond hungry, beyond tired, operating on pure adrenaline and shock. Linda sat on the edge of the bed and took Sarah's hand. "I know this is overwhelming. I know you're scared and confused and probably wondering if you made the right decision. But I want you to know something. These men, for all their faults, they keep their promises. If they said you're protected, you're protected. Now, you get some rest. Tomorrow we figure out the next steps." After Linda left, Sarah locked the door, stripped off her diner uniform, and stood under the shower for 20 minutes, letting the hot water wash away the grime and fear of the day. When she finally emerged and put on the clean clothes Linda had left, sweatpants and a t-shirt that smelled like laundry detergent, she felt marginally more human. She lay down on the bed, certain she was too wired to sleep, but exhaustion finally overwhelmed adrenaline, and she dropped into unconsciousness like a stone into deep water. Outside the clubhouse, the Hells Angels were already mobilizing. Phone calls were made, information was gathered. Within 2 hours, they knew where Derek Mitchell lived, where he worked, where he drank, who his friends were, and what kind of car his cousin the deputy drove. They knew about his drug operation, his gambling debts, and the fact that he'd been bragging about putting his wife in her place. Jack sat at the bar with Hammer, nursing a whiskey. "You know this could get complicated," Hammer said. Jack nodded. "I know. You know Derek's going to escalate. Men like him always do. I know that too." Hammer studied his old friend. "This about your sister." Jack was quiet for a long moment. "Maybe. Probably. Does it matter?" "Not to me," Hammer said. "We voted. She's under our protection. That's the end of the discussion. But Jack, if this goes where I think it's going, we need to be smart about it. We need documentation, witnesses, evidence. We can't just roll up on this guy and put him in the ground, no matter how much he might deserve it. The club can't afford that kind of heat right now." "Understood." But Hammer wasn't finished. "That said, if Derek forces the situation, if he comes at her or us with violence, we respond appropriately. That's self-defense. That's protection. That's what we do." The two men sat in silence, understanding passing between them without need for words. They had been in situations like this before, where the legal system and the moral universe were badly out of alignment. They knew how to navigate that space, how to operate in the grey areas where justice and law didn't always coincide. What they didn't know, what they couldn't have known, was that Derek Mitchell was sitting in his living room 3 miles away, making plans of his own. He had called his cousin Eddie, the deputy sheriff. He had called his friend Marcus, who worked at the county clerk's office. He had called people who owed him favors and people who feared him. Derek wasn't going to let this stand. In his mind, Sarah was his property, and the Hells Angels had stolen from him. More than that, they had humiliated him in public, had challenged his authority, had made him look weak. That was unforgivable. He loaded his hunting rifle and set it by the door. He made a list of targets: the diner, the clubhouse, Jack's personal residence. He drank bourbon and nursed his rage, letting it build into something dark and murderous. By 3 in the morning, Derek Mitchell had convinced himself that violence was not just justified, but necessary. He would show everyone in Reno what happened when you crossed him. He would make Sarah sorry she had ever thought she could leave, and he would make those bikers understand that some men couldn't be intimidated by leather vests and motorcycle clubs. He fell asleep on his couch with the rifle across his lap, his dreams dark with vengeance. What do you think of what you've seen so far? Do you believe the Hells Angels made the right decision by getting involved? Have you ever known someone trapped in an abusive relationship who couldn't find help? We want to hear your thoughts in the comments below. And stay with us. What happens next will challenge everything you think you know about justice, revenge, and the price of protection. Sarah woke to the smell of coffee and bacon. For a disorienting moment, she couldn't remember where she was. Then memory crashed back. Derek, the diner, Jack, the clubhouse. She sat up quickly, her heart racing, half expecting to find it had all been a dream. But the locked door and the borrowed clothes were real. The sounds of voices and movement from the other room were real. She unlocked the door cautiously and found Linda in the small kitchen area, cooking breakfast for what looked like a dozen people. The clubhouse was busier now in daylight. Men moved in and out with purpose, their conversations low and serious. Jack sat at a table with Hammer and several other members, reviewing what looked like photographs and documents. "Morning, sunshine," Linda called out when she spotted Sarah. "You sleep okay?" "Better than I have in years," Sarah admitted. It was true. The locked door and the knowledge that Derek couldn't reach her had allowed her the first genuine rest she'd had in as long as she could remember. Linda fixed her a plate of eggs, bacon and toast. "Eat, you're too skinny. When's the last time you had a decent meal?" Sarah couldn't remember. Derek controlled their grocery money, and she often went without to avoid his anger over spending too much. As she ate, Jack came over and sat across from her. "We need to talk about next steps. There are some people I want you to meet." Over the next hour, Sarah was introduced to what Jack called their support team. There was Karen Mitchell, no relation, a lawyer who specialized in domestic violence cases and did pro bono work for women in crisis. There was James Rodriguez, a private investigator who documented abuse cases. And there was Lisa Chen, who ran a domestic violence shelter and had connections to resources Sarah had never known existed. What Sarah hadn't expected was the level of organization and planning. These weren't vigilantes acting on impulse. They were running a systematic operation with the goal of not just protecting Sarah, but building a legal case that would ensure Derek couldn't hurt her or anyone else again. Karen, the lawyer, sat with Sarah for 2 hours, documenting every incident of abuse she could remember. Dates, locations, injuries, witnesses, every emergency room visit, every police call, every threat. It was exhausting and painful, forcing Sarah to relive trauma she'd worked hard to suppress. But Karen was patient and thorough, occasionally pausing to let Sarah cry or collect herself. Meanwhile, James the investigator was already at work. He'd visited the Desert Rose diner that morning and obtained Frank's statement about the confrontation. He'd requested Sarah's medical records from the 3 different emergency rooms she'd visited over 6 years. He was building a timeline, a pattern, documentation that could withstand legal scrutiny. But not everyone in the clubhouse was convinced this was the right approach. As the morning progressed and more members arrived, tensions began to surface. Tyler, the younger prospect who had objected the night before, wasn't alone in his concerns. Several members worried about the club's exposure, the risk of law enforcement attention, the precedent being set. Around noon, Hammer called a formal church meeting, the club's term for their decision-making sessions. Sarah was asked to wait in her room while the members discussed her situation. She sat on the bed, listening to the muffled sounds of raised voices, unable to make out words, but understanding the emotion behind them. Her future was being decided by a group of outlaw bikers, and the absurdity of that reality wasn't lost on her. Inside the main room, the debate was heated. "We're a motorcycle club, not a social service agency," argued Blake, a member in his 30s who ran a tattoo shop. "We start taking in every woman with a domestic problem, we're going to have the cops crawling up our ass looking for any excuse to shut us down. This is exactly the kind of attention we don't need." Snake leaned back in his chair. "So what are you suggesting? We put her out on the street? Tell her sorry, not our problem. I'm suggesting we help her get to a real shelter, give her some cash, and let professionals handle it. That's what they're trained for." Jack's voice cut through the discussion. "Those professionals have had 6 years to help her. 9 police calls, multiple restraining orders, hospital visits. And where did it get her? Right back in that house with a man who will eventually kill her. So excuse me if I don't have a lot of faith in the system working this time. But that's not our fault," Tyler interjected. "And it's not our responsibility to fix a broken system." Hammer raised his hand for silence. "Let me make something clear. Last night, we voted. That vote stands. Sarah is under our protection. That's not up for debate. What we're discussing now is how we handle that protection in a way that doesn't bring down heat we can't handle. So everybody take a breath and let's think strategically." Robert, an older member who had been quiet until now, spoke up. "I've been in this club for 23 years. I've seen us do a lot of things, some legal, most not. But the one thing that's always set us apart from common criminals is that we have a code. We protect our community. We don't prey on the weak. We don't tolerate rapists or child abusers. matters, and we don't stand by while women get beaten. That's who we are. That's what the patch means. So when Tyler here says this isn't club business, I got to disagree. This is exactly club business. This is about who we are and what we stand for. The words hung in the air. These men had complicated relationships with morality. They broke laws regularly, engaged in illegal activities, existed outside conventional society. But they did have standards, a code that might seem contradictory to outsiders, but made perfect sense within their world. Marcus, the sergeant-at-arms, responsible for club security, raised a practical concern. Derek's not going to let this go. He's got connections to local law enforcement. He's already been making calls, spreading the word that we kidnapped his wife. We need to be prepared for him to come at us legally or physically, and we need to be smart about both. Hammer nodded. Karen's building a case. James is documenting everything. We're going to make sure Sarah files for divorce, gets a proper restraining order, and has every legal protection available. We're going to do this by the book as much as possible, but, and this is important, we're also going to make sure Derek understands that touching her means war, not threats, not posturing, actual consequences. How do we communicate that without it sounding like witness intimidation or threats? Blake asked. We don't have to say anything, Snake replied. We just have to be visible. We make sure Derek sees us everywhere he goes. We make sure he knows we're watching. That's not illegal. That's just being present in public spaces. But the message is clear. The strategy began to take shape. They would maintain a visible but lawful presence. They would document everything Derek did. They would work within the legal system while simultaneously making it clear that the law wasn't the only form of justice available. Jack added another dimension. I want to know everything about Derek's operation, his drug business, his associates, his finances. If we're going to neutralize him, we need leverage. We need to make him more afraid of what we might do than he is interested in getting to Sarah. Hammer looked around the room. All in favor of this approach. Legal action supported by strategic presence and information gathering. Raise your hand. This time, every hand went up, including Tyler's and Blake's. They might have reservations, but they were club members, and club members fell in line once a decision was made. All opposed? Silence. Carried unanimously. Hammer turned to Jack. She's your responsibility, but you've got full club support. Whatever you need, you ask. This ends one of two ways. Either Derek backs off and we never hear from him again, or he forces a confrontation and we finish it. Either way, Sarah walks away safe. The meeting broke up. Members dispersed to their various assignments. Some would begin surveillance on Derek. Others would reach out to contacts in law enforcement to gauge how much protection Derek really had. A few would handle club business that couldn't be neglected just because they were dealing with this situation. Sarah was called back into the main room. Hammer explained the decision and the plan. She listened with a mixture of gratitude and disbelief. These men, criminals by any legal definition, were organizing a sophisticated operation to protect her with a level of care and coordination that exceeded anything the legitimate system had offered. Why are you doing this? She asked again, directing the question to the room at large. I'm nobody. I can't pay you. I can't offer you anything in return. Snake was the one who answered. My daughter was married to a guy like Derek. Beat her for 3 years before she finally got the courage to leave. She came to me for help, and I did what I had to do. That man never touched her again, and I spent 18 months in prison for aggravated assault, worth every day of it. So when you ask why we're doing this, it's because we wish somebody had done it for the women in our lives who needed help. The personal stories began to emerge. Marcus's mother had been murdered by his father when he was 12. Robert's ex-wife had suffered a broken jaw that never healed right. Tyler's sister had needed a restraining order that the police never enforced. Even Blake, who had argued against involvement, admitted that his reluctance came from having watched his mother return to an abusive husband 5 times and feeling helpless to stop the cycle. These men weren't strangers to domestic violence. They had lived with its consequences, seen its devastation, carried its scars. For them, protecting Sarah wasn't charity or obligation. It was personal. It was redemption for the times they couldn't protect someone who mattered. It was justice for the women who never got it. Sarah felt tears streaming down her face, but for the first time in years, they weren't tears of fear or despair. They were tears of recognition, of finally being seen, believed, and defended by people who understood what she'd survived. Linda brought her a box of tissues and wrapped an arm around her shoulders. You're not alone anymore, honey. That's what you need to understand. You've got a whole family now. The word family hit Sarah like a physical force. She'd lost her real family years ago, pushed them away at Derek's insistence, or they'd given up trying to reach her through his walls of control and manipulation. Her parents had died in a car accident when she was 23, before things with Derek got really bad. Her brother lived in Florida and hadn't spoken to her in 3 years after Derek threatened him during a Christmas visit. But here, in this unlikely place surrounded by outlaws and rebels, she was being offered something she thought she'd lost forever. People who would stand with her, fight for her, refuse to abandon her when things got difficult. Jack pulled her aside as the meeting concluded. "I need to be honest with you about something. Derek's not going to accept this quietly. He's going to try to get to you. He might try legal channels, accusing us of kidnapping, filing false police reports. He might try intimidation, or he might try violence. We're prepared for all of it, but you need to be prepared too. That means staying here at the clubhouse where you're protected, following our security protocols, and trusting us when we tell you something's not safe." Sarah nodded. "I understand. Do you? Because the next few weeks are going to be hard. You're going to want your normal life back. You're going to second-guess this decision. You might even think about going back to Derek if he promises to change. That's normal. It's part of the cycle of abuse. But I need you to promise me that you won't make any decisions without talking to me first. Can you do that? I promise." Jack studied her face, looking for cracks in her resolve. He'd seen this before. Women who fled abusive situations only to return when the fear faded and the promises started. But something in Sarah's eyes suggested she was different. Maybe it was having hit rock bottom. Maybe it was having finally found people who believed her. Or maybe it was simply that she was tired of being afraid. The rest of the day passed in a blur of activity. Karen, the lawyer, filed emergency paperwork for a restraining order and began divorce proceedings. James, the investigator, continued building the case file. Members of the club took turns on surveillance duty, tracking Derek's movements and documenting his activities. By evening, they had discovered something significant. Derek had indeed been making calls, not just to his cousin, the deputy, but to several local officers. But the response he was getting wasn't what he expected. The police weren't rushing to rescue his wife from a biker gang. Instead, they were telling him to stay away from the clubhouse, to let the courts handle it, to avoid escalating the situation. Derek's connections weren't as strong as he'd believed, or perhaps more accurately, the Hells Angels' reputation was stronger. Local law enforcement knew that starting a war with the club over a domestic dispute would end badly for everyone involved. This should have been good news. But Snake, who had been following Derek that afternoon, reported something troubling. Derek had visited a gun store and purchased ammunition. He'd met with 3 men at a bar, known associates who had criminal records for assault and weapons charges. He was building his own small army. Hammer called another quick meeting. "Derek's organizing. Looks like he's planning something. We need to increase security here and make sure Sarah's never alone or exposed." The atmosphere in the clubhouse shifted. This was no longer just about protection. It was about preparing for a confrontation that seemed increasingly inevitable. That night, Sarah lay in her locked room, listening to the sounds of men moving outside her door. Guards posted, weapons checked, plans discussed. She thought about the life she'd left behind, the apartment she'd shared with Derek, her job at the diner, the small routines that had made up her existence. She didn't miss any of it. That realization was both liberating and terrifying. For 6 years, she'd told herself she was staying for reasons: financial security, fear of being alone, the sunk cost of a marriage she'd invested so much in, the belief that maybe Derek would change. But the truth was simpler and darker. She'd stayed because she couldn't imagine any alternative. Now, lying in this small room in a biker clubhouse, protected by men's society called criminals, she could imagine something different. Not just survival, but actually living, having choices, making decisions without fear, being a person again instead of a possession. She didn't know what would happen with Derek. She didn't know if the legal system would finally protect her or if violence was inevitable. But she knew with absolute certainty that she would never go back. Whatever it cost, whatever it took, she was done being Derek Mitchell's victim. In his house across town, Derek sat cleaning his rifle with methodical precision. He'd made his decision too. The Hells Angels thought they could take his wife and face no consequences. They thought their reputation made them untouchable. They were about to learn differently. He would wait a few more days, let them get comfortable, let them think he'd back down. Then he would strike, hard, fast, and in a way that would send a message to everyone in Reno about what happened when you disrespected Derek Mitchell. Two forces were now moving toward collision. The only question was how much much destruction there would be when they met. We want to take a moment to thank you for staying with this story. What you're about to witness in the next 2 chapters will test every assumption you have about justice, violence, and the price of protection. The situation is escalating, and there's no turning back for anyone involved. Before we continue, we need to hear from you. Do you think violence is ever justified in protecting abuse victims? Where's the line between justice and revenge? Share your thoughts in the comments and stay with us, because the best and most shocking parts of this story are still ahead. The next 3 weeks settled into an uneasy routine. Sarah remained at the clubhouse, venturing out only with escorts and only for essential activities. Meetings with her lawyer, sessions with a therapist who specialized in trauma, and one carefully coordinated trip to retrieve personal belongings from the apartment she'd shared with Derek. That trip had been tense. Jack and 4 other members had accompanied her, their motorcycles forming a visible barrier between Sarah and any potential threat. Derek wasn't home. They'd made sure of that through surveillance, but his presence haunted every room. Sarah moved through the apartment quickly, grabbing clothes, documents, and a few personal items that mattered to her. The wedding photos stayed on the wall. The gifts Derek had given her remained in their places. She took only what was hers, and nothing that would give him an excuse to claim she'd stolen from him. As they were leaving, Sarah paused in the doorway and looked back one last time. This apartment had been her prison for 6 years. Now it was just a space, walls and furniture with no power over her anymore. She pulled the door closed with a sense of finality that felt like breaking chains. The legal proceedings were moving forward. Karen had secured a temporary restraining order that prohibited Derek from coming within 500 feet of Sarah. Divorce papers had been served. Derek had retained his own lawyer and was fighting everything, contesting the divorce, claiming Sarah had been brainwashed by a cult, alleging that she'd stolen marital property. But here's where things got interesting. James, the investigator, had been thorough, very thorough. He'd discovered that Derek's drug operation was more extensive than anyone had realized. He was moving product through his construction sites, using legitimate business as cover for trafficking. James had photographs, transaction records, testimony from workers who'd been coerced into participating. This information was valuable for 2 reasons. First, it gave the Hells Angels leverage. They could turn this evidence over to law enforcement at any time, which would result in Derek facing serious federal charges. Second, it complicated Derek's attempts to use his law enforcement connections against them. The same cops who might have been willing to help him with a domestic dispute would have to think twice about protecting someone involved in drug trafficking. Hammer made the strategic decision to approach Derek's cousin Eddie, the deputy sheriff, directly. The meeting happened at a neutral location, a coffee shop in downtown Reno, where both men could sit in public view. Eddie was 38 years old, a 15-year veteran of the sheriff's department with political ambitions and a reputation for being tough on crime. He'd helped Derek in the past because family loyalty ran deep, and domestic calls were often seen as private matters not worth pursuing aggressively. But when Hammer laid out the evidence of Derek's drug operation across the table, Eddie's face went pale. "You're telling me my cousin is trafficking heroin through construction sites?" Eddie's voice was low, aware of the other patrons around them. Hammer shrugged. "I'm telling you that's what the evidence suggests. Now, I'm not a cop, so I don't know if that evidence would hold up in court, but it sure would make interesting reading for your sheriff, or maybe the DEA, if it somehow found its way to the right people." Eddie's jaw tightened. "You're threatening me. I'm giving you information. What you do with it is your business. But here's the thing. Your cousin's been using your name and your badge as a shield for his behavior. Every time Sarah called for help, he made sure certain officers responded. Officers who knew you. Officers who looked the other way because Derek was family. That puts you in a difficult position." Eddie was silent, his mind visibly working through implications and consequences. Hammer continued. "Here's what I'm proposing. Derek leaves Sarah alone. Completely. He signs the divorce papers, he drops the custody fight over the property, and he goes away. In return, this evidence about his business activities never sees the light of day. Everybody moves on. Sarah gets her freedom, Derek keeps his freedom, and you don't have to explain to your boss why you were running interference for a drug dealer. And if Derek doesn't agree to this, then the evidence goes to federal prosecutors, and Derek's looking at 10 to 15 years in a federal penitentiary. And honestly, Eddie, I don't think you want your name came anywhere near that investigation. Cops who protect drug dealers, that doesn't play well for someone with political ambitions. Eddie stared at Hammer for a long moment. This is blackmail. Call it whatever makes you sleep better at night. I call it offering everyone a way out of a bad situation. You talk to Derek. You make him understand that his best option is to let Sarah go and move on with his life. You do that, and this evidence disappears. Everybody wins. And if Derek doesn't listen to me, then you might want to start distancing yourself from him, because when he goes down, he's going to try to take everyone around him with him. That's what desperate men do. The meeting ended with no agreement, but Hammer had planted the seed. He knew Eddie would be having a serious conversation with Derek, driven by self-preservation, if not morality. Back at the clubhouse, Sarah was making progress of her own. The therapy sessions were helping her understand the patterns of abuse, the psychology of control, and why she'd stayed as long as she had. Linda had become a mentor and friend, sharing her own experiences of what it meant to be connected to outlaw culture while maintaining personal boundaries and self-respect. Sarah had also started helping around the clubhouse, cooking, cleaning, organizing. It gave her purpose and kept her mind occupied. The men treated her with respect that bordered on reverence, as if they understood she represented something important about their own code and values. But despite the progress, everyone could feel the tension building. Derek had gone quiet. No more phone calls to his cousin. No more attempts to confront Sarah. No more legal maneuvering. It was the silence before a storm, and every experienced member of the club recognized it. Snake reported that Derek had stopped going to work. His truck remained parked at his house for days at a time. The men he'd been meeting with were also lying low. It was the behavior of someone planning something, waiting for the right moment. Hammer increased security around the clubhouse. They installed additional cameras. They varied Sarah's routine so she never left or arrived at predictable times. They made sure she was never in a location that couldn't be secured. Jack spent hours reviewing the security footage, studying patterns, looking for any indication of what Derek might be planning. He knew men like Derek. He'd been a man like Derek once, angry, violent, convinced that the world owed him something, and determined to take it by force. He understood how Derek was thinking because he remembered thinking the same way before his sister's death had shattered his worldview and rebuilt him into something different. One evening, Jack sat with Sarah on the clubhouse's small back patio, smoking a cigarette while she drank tea. The sun was setting over the Nevada desert, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that seemed impossible in their intensity. "Tell me about your sister," Sarah said quietly. Jack was silent for so long that Sarah thought he might not answer. Then he began to talk. Her name was Michelle. She was 2 years younger than me. Smartest person I ever knew. Could have been anything she wanted. But she fell in love with the wrong guy when she was 19. His name was Travis. At first, he was charming, attentive, everything a young girl thinks love should look like. Then he started isolating her from our family. Then came the controlling behavior. Then the first time he hit her. Jack took a drag on his cigarette, his eyes distant with memory. She tried to leave him 3 times. Every time he'd find her, apologize, promise to change, and every time he got worse. The last time she tried to leave, she came to me for help. But I was already in deep with the club, running guns, getting into trouble. I was facing weapons charges and looking at serious time. I told her to go to the police, to get a restraining order, to do it the legal way, because I couldn't help her without making things worse. What happened? I went to prison. Michelle went back to Travis because she didn't know what else to do, and she was pregnant with his child. 2 months after I started my sentence, Travis beat her so badly she lost the baby. She died in the hospital 3 days later from internal bleeding. She was 24 years old. Sarah reached over and took his hand. "It's not your fault." Jack shook his head. "Maybe not legally, but I knew what Travis was. I knew Michelle was in danger, and I chose to believe that the system would protect her because I couldn't. I was wrong. So when I see women like you trapped in situations like Michelle was in, I can't walk away. I won't make that mistake again." They sat in silence, watching the last of the sunset fade into twilight. Sarah understood now why Jack had helped her without hesitation, why this had become so personal for him, why the entire club had rallied around her protection. She wasn't just a stranger in need. She was every woman these men had failed to protect, every sister and mother and daughter who had slipped through the cracks of a system that wasn't designed to save them. The next morning brought news that changed everything. Eddie, the deputy, showed up at the club clubhouse, a risky move that indicated desperation. Hammer met him outside, away from the main building. "I talked to Derek," Eddie said without preamble. "Showed him the evidence, explained his options. He's not going to take the deal." Hammer's expression didn't change. "What's he planning?" Eddie hesitated, then made a decision that would cost him his badge but might save lives. "He's planning to hit the clubhouse. He's got 4 guys with him. They're talking about tonight or tomorrow night. They've got weapons, rifles, handguns. Derek's convinced that if he takes out Jack and scares the rest of you, everyone will back off and he can get Sarah back." Hammer absorbed this information. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I'm not willing to have my cousin's murder spree on my conscience. And make no mistake, that's what this would be. Murder. He's not thinking clearly. He's not thinking about consequences. He's just angry and armed and dangerous." Eddie met Hammer's eyes. "Stop him. Do whatever you have to do. I'll make sure responding officers take their time getting there. After that, I can't help you." Eddie left without waiting for a response. Hammer immediately called church. Within minutes, every available member was at the clubhouse. Sarah was moved to a secure location, a member's house across town where Derek would never think to look for her. Linda went with her, along with 2 armed guards. The clubhouse prepared for war. Weapons were distributed. Positions were assigned. Cameras were monitored. The plan was simple. Let Derek come, document everything, and respond with appropriate force when he made his move. They had the advantage of preparation, defensive position, and numbers. Derek had rage and desperation, but Jack wanted to try one more thing. He called Derek's cell phone. To everyone's surprise, Derek answered. "Mitchell." "Derek, it's Jack Davidson, the biker from the diner." There was a long silence. "What do you want?" "I want to offer you a way out of this. You're planning something stupid. We know about it. Law enforcement knows about it. You come at this clubhouse and you're going to end up dead or in prison. Is that really what you want?" Derek's laugh was bitter. "You took my wife. You destroyed my life. You think I'm just going to walk away? Your wife left because you beat her for 6 years. We didn't take her. We protected her from you. There's a difference. She belongs to me." Jack's voice went cold. "She's not property, Derek. She's a human being who deserves to live without fear. You had 6 years to be the man she needed. You chose violence instead. That's on you. You don't get to lecture me about violence, biker. I know what you people do. You're criminals. You're thugs. You have no right to judge me." Jack took a deep breath. "You're right. I am a criminal. I've done things I'm not proud of, but I've never hit a woman. I've never terrorized someone weaker than me. I've never used love as an excuse for control. So yeah, I'm judging you. And here's what I'm offering. Walk away. Sign the divorce papers. Leave Reno. Start over somewhere else. We've got evidence of your drug operation that would put you away for a decade. We're willing to make that evidence disappear if you just walk away. Or you can come at us tonight, and this ends badly for everyone. Your choice. I'll see you in hell," Derek said and hung up. Jack looked around at his brothers. "He's coming, probably tonight. Everybody stay sharp." The waiting was the hardest part. Hours passed. Darkness fell. The clubhouse was silent except for the occasional murmur of communication from members at their positions. Sarah, safe at the remote house, couldn't sleep. She paced the living room, racked with guilt that these men were in danger because of her. Linda watched her with understanding. "This isn't your fault, honey. This is Derek's choice. You didn't make him violent. You didn't force him to escalate. All you did was ask for help. The rest is on him. But what if someone gets hurt? What if someone dies because of me? Then that's on Derek too. That's the thing you need to understand. You're not responsible for his actions. You never were. That's what abusers do. They make you feel like you're the cause of their violence. Like if you were just better, smarter, quieter, more obedient, they wouldn't have to hurt you. But that's a lie, Sarah. The violence was always in them. You were just convenient." It was almost midnight when the security cameras picked up movement. A vehicle approached slowly, lights off, parking 2 blocks away. 4 figures emerged, all carrying long guns. They moved with the caution of men who knew they were outgunned but were too committed to turn back. Derek Mitchell and his 3 companions approached the clubhouse from different angles, clearly planning a coordinated assault. What they didn't know was that every move was being recorded on multiple cameras, that law enforcement had been notified and was holding back per Eddie's arrangement, and that they were walking into a position defended by men who had spent decades preparing for exactly this kind of confrontation. Hammer's voice came over the radio system, connecting all members. "Remember, we document everything. We give clear warnings. We only engage if they fire first or attempt entry. This is about defense, not not revenge. Stay disciplined. Derek reached the front gate first. He was carrying a hunting rifle, and even in the darkness, the cameras could see his face, twisted with rage and determination. He raised his weapon toward the clubhouse door. Jack stepped out onto the front porch, clearly visible in the exterior lights. Behind him, armed members took positions at windows and doorways, their weapons visible but not raised. "Derek!" Jack's voice carried across the compound. "This is your last chance. Put down the weapon and walk away. Nobody has to get hurt tonight." Derek's response was to raise his rifle and point it directly at Jack. What happened next was captured on 6 different cameras from multiple angles. Derek fired first, a single shot that splintered the doorframe 2 feet from Jack's head. That shot, documented and unprovoked, changed everything from a legal standpoint. It transformed the situation from vigilante action to legitimate self-defense. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Members returned fire with precision that came from years of experience. Derek went down first, hit in the shoulder and leg. His 3 companions scattered, firing wildly, trying to reach cover. One made it back to their vehicle. The other 2 were pinned down, unable to advance or retreat, finally dropping their weapons and surrendering when it became clear they were hopelessly outmatched. The entire confrontation lasted less than 3 minutes. When it was over, Derek Mitchell lay bleeding in the parking lot, his rifle several feet away. His grand plan collapsed into absolute failure. His companions were face down on the ground, hands behind their heads, waiting for the police who were now being allowed to respond. Jack walked out to where Derek lay. The wound in his leg was serious but not immediately fatal. He was conscious, groaning in pain and rage. "This didn't have to happen," Jack said quietly. "You could have walked away. You could have chosen differently." Derek spat blood. "You'll pay for this, all of you." Jack shook his head. "No, Derek, you're going to prison for a long time. Not just for this assault, but for the drug trafficking we've already turned over to the feds. When you get out, if you get out, Sarah will have built a whole new life somewhere you'll never find her. This is over. You lost." Sirens approached in the distance. Jack returned to the clubhouse. By the time police arrived, the scene was secure. Weapons laid down, hands visible, everyone compliant. The video footage was immediately provided to investigators, showing clearly who had fired first and how the club members had responded defensively. Derek Mitchell was arrested and charged with attempted murder, assault with a deadly weapon, and after federal prosecutors reviewed James's evidence, multiple drug trafficking charges. His 3 companions faced similar charges. Eddie, the deputy, resigned from the sheriff's department before he could be fired, having destroyed his law enforcement career to do the right thing. The aftermath brought unexpected attention. Local news covered the story extensively, framing it as bikers defending themselves against a violent domestic abuser. National media picked it up, creating a complex narrative about vigilante justice, the failures of the domestic violence system, and the unlikely heroes who emerged from outlaw culture. But for Sarah, safe in that remote house with Linda, the most important thing was simpler and more profound. When Linda's phone rang and Hammer confirmed that Derek was in custody and seriously injured, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in 6 years. She felt safe, not just protected, not just defended, but genuinely safe, free, done. She collapsed into Linda's arms and cried, not from fear or sadness, but from relief so intense it was almost painful. "It's over," Linda whispered. "You're free. You're really free." And for the first time in as long as she could remember, Sarah believed it. The trial of Derek Mitchell became one of the most watched legal proceedings in Nevada that year. Prosecutors had evidence that few domestic violence cases ever assembled. Video footage, medical records spanning 6 years, testimony from multiple witnesses, and documentation of systematic abuse that painted an undeniable picture of terror and control. Derek's defense team tried to argue that he was the victim, that his wife had been kidnapped by a motorcycle gang, that he was simply trying to rescue her, that the Hells Angels had provoked the confrontation. But the video footage destroyed that narrative. The cameras showed clearly that Derek had approached the clubhouse armed, that he had fired first, that he had come with intent to commit violence. The drug trafficking charges sealed his fate. Federal prosecutors presented evidence of a distribution network operating through Derek's construction business, trafficking heroin and methamphetamine throughout northern Nevada. The amount of product moving through his operation elevated the charges to federal level with mandatory minimum sentences. Sarah was required to testify. The days leading up to it yet were excruciating. She would have to face Derek in court, recount the worst moments of their marriage in front of strangers, expose her shame and vulnerability to public scrutiny. Jack accompanied her to the courthouse, sitting in the gallery where she could see him, a silent reminder that she wasn't alone. When Sarah took the stand, something remarkable happened. She didn't crumble. She didn't minimize or excuse or apologize. She told the truth in a clear, steady voice, describing 6 years of escalating violence, systematic isolation, economic control, and emotional abuse that had nearly destroyed her. She showed the scars on her ribs where Derek had broken them. She identified hospital records and police reports. She refused to be shamed or intimidated. Derek watched her with pure hatred, but he was in shackles and surrounded by guards. He had no power here. The courtroom was not his domain. And Sarah, testifying about her own victimization, was reclaiming the narrative of her life from someone who had spent years trying to write it for her. The verdict was swift and decisive, guilty on all counts. Derek Mitchell was sentenced to 18 years in federal prison with no possibility of parole for the first 10. His 3 accomplices received sentences ranging from 5 to 8 years. The judge, in her remarks, specifically noted the failure of the justice system to protect Sarah Mitchell and the tragic reality that it had taken intervention from a motorcycle club to provide the safety that should have been guaranteed by law enforcement. That statement sparked a broader conversation in Nevada and beyond about domestic violence response, police training, and the systemic failures that leave victims vulnerable. Sarah found herself at the center of that conversation, invited to speak at advocacy groups and policy meetings. She was terrified at first, but Linda coached her, and Jack provided security for her public appearances. Sarah discovered something unexpected. She was good at advocacy. Her story resonated with thousands of women who saw themselves in her experience. She spoke not from theoretical knowledge, but from lived reality, and that authenticity was powerful. Within 6 months, she had become the face of domestic violence reform in Nevada, working with legislators to strengthen protective orders, improve police response protocols, and increase funding for victim services. But the story had one more revelation that no one except Jack and Hammer knew. 8 months after Derek's trial, Sarah was speaking at a fundraiser for a domestic violence shelter in Reno. The event was well attended, including several members of the Hells Angels who had become unlikely allies in the advocacy movement. After her speech, a woman approached her, late 50s, graying hair, eyes that held grief and recognition. "You don't know me," the woman said, "but I know your story. My name is Catherine Davidson. Jack is my son." Sarah invited her to sit, confused about why Jack's mother would be introducing herself. Catherine took a deep breath. "I need to tell you something that Jack probably never will. He told you about his sister Michelle, didn't he? About her abusive husband, about how she died while Jack was in prison." Sarah nodded. Catherine's hands trembled slightly. "What he didn't tell you is that Michelle's husband, Travis, he's Derek Mitchell's older brother, their family. When Michelle died, Travis served 3 years for involuntary manslaughter, got out on good behavior. Last we heard, he was living in Arizona. Derek witnessed what happened to Michelle. He saw his brother beat a woman to death, saw him go to prison, and somehow learned nothing from it. Became exactly the same kind of monster. Sarah felt like the air had been knocked out of her lungs. Jack knew. This whole time, he knew Derek was his sister's brother-in-law. Catherine shook her head. He didn't. Not at first. He found out about 2 weeks into protecting you, when James was doing the background investigation. Pulled me aside and asked me to confirm whether Derek was related to Travis. I told him yes. He didn't say anything, just nodded, and went back to planning your protection. But I know my son. This wasn't just about protecting a stranger for him. This was about saving the woman his sister could have been if someone had intervened in time. The revelation recontextualized everything. Jack hadn't just been helping Sarah out of abstract morality or general principles. He had been fighting a personal battle against a family that had taken his sister's life. He had been given a second chance to do what he couldn't do for Michelle, to intervene early enough, effectively enough, to prevent another tragedy. Sarah found Jack later that evening, standing outside the venue smoking a cigarette. She approached him directly. "Why didn't you tell me Derek was Travis's brother?" Jack didn't look surprised that she knew. "Would it have changed anything?" "I don't know. Maybe. I might have felt like I was being used to settle an old score." Jack turned to face her. "Were you being used?" Sarah thought about it. No, I don't think I was. Jack nodded. I helped you because you needed help, because what was happening to you was wrong, because I could do something about it. The connection to my sister, that made it personal for me, yeah, made it impossible to walk away. But it doesn't change the fact that you deserve protection regardless of who your husband was related to. They stood in silence for a moment, watching the evening traffic pass on the street beyond. Thank you, Sarah said quietly, for everything, for believing me, for protecting me, for not letting Derek destroy me the way Travis destroyed Michelle. Jack's voice was rough with emotion. Thank you for having the courage to ask for help, for fighting through this, for turning your pain into something that might help other people. Michelle would have liked you. That moment became the foundation for something unexpected, a genuine friendship that transcended the dramatic circumstances of their meeting. Sarah became a regular presence at the clubhouse, not as a victim needing protection, but as an advocate collaborating with the club on community outreach programs. The Hells Angels, Reno chapter in turn, became unlikely allies in domestic violence prevention, providing security at shelters, escorting women who needed protection, and using their intimidating reputation for genuinely positive purposes. Linda became Sarah's business partner. Together, they founded a non-profit called Second Chances that helped domestic violence survivors with everything from legal advocacy to job training to safe housing. The organization was funded partly by traditional grants and donations, but also by fundraisers organized by the Hells Angels, creating an unusual but effective coalition between the outlaw biker community and mainstream social services. Derek Mitchell's case became a catalyst for legislative reform. Nevada passed Sarah's Law, which mandated specialized domestic violence training for all law enforcement officers, created a statewide database to track repeat offenders, and established automatic investigation reviews when protective orders were violated. The law wasn't perfect, but it represented acknowledgement that the system had failed and needed fundamental reform. 2 years after the confrontation at the clubhouse, Sarah stood at a podium in the Nevada state legislature, watching the governor sign Sarah's law into effect. Jack stood in the back of the room, declining the invitation to join her on stage. He didn't need recognition. The law was recognition enough, proof that sometimes, when people with power refused to act, people without conventional authority could create change through sheer force of will and moral conviction. Sarah had rebuilt her life completely. She had her own apartment, her own bank account, her own choices. She dated occasionally, though she was cautious about trust and careful about boundaries. She maintained relationships with the Hells Angels community, attending club events and remaining close with Jack, Linda, and several other members who had become genuine friends. She also maintained contact with some of Derek's family, not out of obligation, but because she understood that they were victims of his violence in different ways. Derek's mother called her once, apologizing through tears for not believing Sarah's earlier complaints, for enabling her son's behavior, for choosing family loyalty over moral clarity. Sarah forgave her, understanding that forgiveness wasn't about absolving guilt, but about releasing the hold that anger and resentment had on her own healing. Travis, Derek's brother, reached out from Arizona 3 years after Derek's conviction. The letter was brief and painful to read. He wrote about watching from prison as his younger brother followed the exact same path of violence and control. He wrote about his own guilt, his own failure to intervene or warn anyone, his own complicity through silence. He wrote that he thought about Michelle every day, and he was grateful that Sarah had survived what his wife had not. Sarah didn't respond immediately. She showed the letter to her therapist, processed her feelings about it, and eventually wrote back. Not to absolve him or suggest his guilt was manageable, but to acknowledge his honesty and to say that Michelle's memory deserved to be honored by people committing to be better than they were. It was a small gesture, but it felt important. The Hells Angels. Reno chapter underwent changes too. The publicity from Sarah's case brought attention, both positive and negative. Law enforcement scrutinized their activities more closely, but they also gained community respect that had been absent before. They were still outlaws by legal definition, still operated outside conventional boundaries, but they had demonstrated capacity for protection and justice that the legitimate system sometimes lacked. Hammer retired as club president after 33 years, handing leadership to a younger member while remaining an advisor. Jack stayed active but spent more time on community outreach than and club business. Snake opened a victim advocacy consulting firm, training other security professionals on how to handle domestic violence cases. The club's reputation evolved from simply dangerous to dangerously protective, a subtle but significant distinction. 5 years after the night Sarah begged a biker for help, she stood at the Desert Rose Diner for the first time since that November evening. The diner had been sold to new owners, but Frank still worked there, now as the manager. He'd invited Sarah and Jack to a small anniversary event he was hosting, a fundraiser for second chances. The parking lot looked different in daylight, less ominous, just an ordinary strip of asphalt where ordinary people parked ordinary cars. But Sarah could still see the exact spot where Derek's truck had been, could still feel the terror that had gripped her as she'd made the desperate decision to ask a stranger for help. Jack stood beside her, older now, grayer, but still carrying that same quiet intensity. "How does it feel to be back?" "Like visiting a museum of someone else's life," Sarah said. "That person who worked here, who was too afraid to ask for help, who thought her situation was hopeless. She feels like a stranger now. That's because she is. You're not that person anymore." Sarah nodded. She'd done years of therapy, worked through trauma, rebuilt her sense of self from foundations that Derek had tried to demolish. She understood now that healing wasn't linear, that triggers could still catch her off guard, that the scars, physical and emotional, would always be part of her story, but they didn't define her anymore. She had taken her pain and transformed it into purpose, her victimization into advocacy, her desperation into determination to ensure other women had options she'd been denied. Inside the diner, about 50 people had gathered, domestic violence survivors, advocates, law enforcement officials who had embraced the new protocols, members of the Hells Angels. It was an unlikely coalition, brought together by a shared understanding that protection and justice sometimes required unconventional alliances. Frank raised a glass of coffee and toast. 5 years ago, something happened in this diner that changed my understanding of heroism. I watched a terrified woman ask a stranger for help, and I watched that stranger say yes without hesitation. I watched a community decide that violence against women wasn't acceptable, wasn't private, and wasn't something we could ignore. Since then, Second Chances has helped 347 women escape abusive situations. 92 children have been removed from dangerous homes. 5 pieces of legislation have passed, and it all started right here, at this booth, with one question and one answer. To Sarah and Jack, thank you for showing us what courage looks like. The applause was genuine and warm. Sarah felt tears prick her eyes, but they were good tears now. Tears of gratitude and recognition and community. Later, as the event wound down, a young woman approached Sarah hesitantly. Her name was Maria. She was 23, with a bruise on her wrist that her long sleeves didn't quite hide. She spoke in a near whisper. "I saw your TED Talk about how you got out, about how you found people who believed you. I'm in a situation like you were. My boyfriend, he's been getting worse. I'm scared. I don't know what to do." Sarah took both of Maria's hands gently. "You just did the hardest thing. You asked for help. Everything else we can figure out together. You're not alone anymore." She introduced Maria to Linda, who immediately began the intake process for Second Chances. They would provide emergency housing, legal advocacy, therapy, job training, all the resources Sarah had wished existed when she was trapped. As she watched Linda guide Maria away, Sarah felt the weight of responsibility and possibility. Every person they helped was validation that the trauma she'd survived had meaning, had purpose, could be transformed into something redemptive. Jack had watched the interaction from across the room. When Sarah returned to his side, he nodded approvingly. "You're good at this. I learned from the best," she replied. "You showed me that protecting people isn't about having authority or permission. It's about seeing someone who needs help and deciding you're going to be the person who provides it, regardless of convenience or cost." Jack smiled, a rare expression that softened his weathered features. "My sister would have been proud of what you've built." "I hope so." Sarah paused, then continued. "I think about Michelle sometimes, about how different things might have been if someone had intervened for her the way you intervened for me. Not that it would erase what happened, but maybe someone else would be standing here instead of us," Jack finished. "Yeah, I think about that too, but we can't change the past. We can only influence the future. And every Maria we help, every woman who escapes before it's too late, that's Michelle's legacy as much as yours." The sun was setting as they left the diner, painting the Nevada sky in those impossible colors that seemed unique to the desert. Sarah's life had fractured that night 5 years ago, shattered into pieces that seemed irreparable, but she'd rebuilt it into something stronger, more purposeful, more authentically hers than anything she'd known before. She'd learned that strength wasn't about never being broken. It was about breaking and choosing to heal. It was about surviving and deciding that survival wasn't enough. You had to live, you had to fight, you had to ensure that the pain you'd endured created pathways for others to escape similar suffering. She'd learned that heroes didn't always look like they did in movies. Sometimes they wore leather vests and rode motorcycles. Sometimes they were gruff men with criminal records who understood justice in ways that had nothing to do with courts and laws. Sometimes they were women who'd survived their own hells and decided to build shelters for others, still trapped in the flames. She'd learned that family wasn't always biological. It was the people who showed up when you needed them, who kept their promises, who stood between you and danger without calculating cost or convenience. As Jack's motorcycle rumbled to life in the parking lot, Sarah looked back one more time at the Desert Rose Diner. This place would always be significant, the location where her life had pivoted from victim to survivor, from hopeless to determined, from alone to surrounded by unlikely allies. But it was just a building now. The real change had happened inside her, in the decision to ask for help, in the choice to accept it, in the commitment to transform trauma into advocacy. That change was permanent. That change was hers. Derek Mitchell remained in federal prison, still maintaining his innocence, still blaming Sarah and the Hells Angels for destroying his life. He would be eligible for parole in 5 more years. Sarah had already prepared herself for that eventuality, had restraining orders in place, had security protocols established, had a network of support ready to activate if he was released and posed a threat. But she wasn't afraid anymore. Fear had been Derek's primary weapon, the tool he'd used to control her for 6 years. She'd disarmed that weapon by refusing to let it dictate her choices. If Derek was released and came looking for her, he would find not the terrified waitress he remembered, but a woman who had built an organization, changed laws, and surrounded herself with people who would protect her just as fiercely as she now protected others. The cycle had broken. The pattern had been interrupted. And while Derek rotted in a cell, blaming everyone but himself, Sarah had created something beautiful and meaningful from the ashes of her former life. That was the real victory. Not Derek's imprisonment, though that mattered. Not the legislative changes, though those would help countless others. The victory was that Sarah Mitchell had reclaimed her name, her identity, her future. She was no longer defined by what had been done to her, but by what she had chosen to become despite it. This is how lives change. Not always through conventional means, not always through official channels, but through people deciding that witnessing injustice isn't enough. You have to act. Through strangers becoming family, through pain becoming purpose, through one desperate plea in a diner and one biker who remembered his sister and refused to let another woman die alone. Sarah's story resonates because it challenges our assumptions about who helps and who needs help, about what justice looks like, and about whether systems that fail can be circumvented by communities willing to protect their most vulnerable members. It's complicated and messy and doesn't fit neatly into categories of right and wrong, but it's real. Now, we want to hear from you. Do you think the Hells Angels did the right thing? Would you have had the courage to ask for help the way Sarah did? Have you ever been in a position where you had to choose between following rules and doing what felt morally necessary? Share your story in the comments below. We read every single one and want to hear your perspective. If this story moved you, please subscribe to our channel and click the notification bell so you never miss stories that matter. These are real experiences from real people, showing us that heroism isn't always convenient, justice isn't always legal, and sometimes the people society dismisses are the ones who step up when everyone else turns away. And don't leave yet. Click on the video appearing on your screen right now for another incredible story of courage, survival, and unexpected heroism that will restore your faith in humanity. Thank you for watching, thank you for caring, and thank you for being part of a community that believes everyone deserves safety, dignity, and a second chance. This has been the story of Sarah Mitchell and the Hells Angels who saved her life. But really, it's the story of anyone who's ever felt trapped and powerless, and the reminder that help can come from the most unexpected places if you're brave enough to ask for it.